Previously on Get In The Mecha.
The restriction of space should be seen as just as important and valuable when it comes to analyzing anime, in my opinion, and aspect ratios in anime filmmaking, as much as expanding space and creating large space. I think space is probably one of the most vital factors when it comes to storytelling, and sadly it's the one which is overlooked the most. I'm Jamal, and you're listening to Get In The Mecha, your weekly anime and manga analysis podcast. From inspiring arcs to game-changing cinematography, I'm on a journey to try and make sense of it all, episode by episode. Enjoy the show. Welcome back to Get In The Mecha, and in today's episode we are going to be looking at the Gridman series. I do often talk about Evangelion on this show, and I do want to talk more about other mecha anime, and I think Gridman, as it is something that is still probably a bit in conversation right now with the Dynazenon finale, when this is being recorded, should be out like today, I think, assuming everything goes well. And so I want to talk about this notion of awkwardness in the series and how it's a really big part of its direction. In this week's episode, I really want to cover why this is such an important part of it and why it isn't something that should be dismissed as filler or something anywhere near that, because it plays a massive part in what this series is and why it works so well. So I want to try and get to the bottom of that this episode. As always, if you do enjoy this podcast, it would be appreciated if you left it a review on Apple Podcasts. Wherever you do leave reviews, even though I think Apple Podcasts is the only place, if you could leave a 5-star review, that would help out a ton. And so let's get into the episode for this week. That is episode 92 of Get In The Mecha, Why Awkwardness Matters in the Gridman series. As always, before we dive into the content, I like to just make you aware of spoilers, because I refuse to let you blame me if you are spoiled for a show they're really into. And in this case, there will be some minor spoilers for the Gridman series. I'm not going to go too in depth, but we will look quite specifically at a very specific episode of this show, because it's probably the best case study for understanding this notion of awkwardness and why it's so important to the series. So a lot of our discussion and analysis in this episode begins with the Churro Scene. It sounds like a very comical name, I know, and I'm sure as a Dynazenon viewer you know exactly what I'm talking about, but just as a refresher, SSSS.Dynazenon's Churro Scene takes place in episode 5, and it's this very, very awkward encounter with the two of the main characters, Yomugi and Yume. They're at this water park, and what happens pretty much is Yume and Yomugi, they're standing almost face to face. Yume is sitting down, eating a churro, and Yomugi kind of just comes up to it. Okay, because they're supposed to be acting like a couple for the sake of this, what Gama calls a mission in order to bust the kaiju eugenicists. And so what they do is they do exactly that, and then Yume decides to eat a churro. She's sitting down. Yomugi comes up and asks, she's eating already. Does it taste good? She says that the sugar is spilling everywhere. Loads of awkward silence in between until someone breaks the silence, pretty much. It's probably one of my favorite scenes in Dynazenon, and it did go kind of viral-ish on the internet, even though not enough people are watching this anime. I think that people would get the wrong impression of this show, but also the right one at the same time. I think gauging the reactions online, some people, went for the standard, this is just fillery, this is, they ran out of money, or, how do we stretch out the budget type thing. And then you also had the other approach of, this is how teenagers act. This is just normal stuff. I actually find this really funny. This is entertaining. And I'm more in line with the second one. But what I want to do today in this episode is try and get to the depth of why and how is Dynazenon's awkwardness created and why it's so important to this anime, because it's probably the thing that I love the most. If I was to select one thing about its direction that I love so much, and to be honest, a lot of the things fall into it, as in a lot of the things that Dynazenon does is what it all falls into this subtitle of awkwardness and normality, creating normality. And so this week, episode 92, the goal is going to be to try and understand this a bit more and get to the real core of why it's so important in this show. To cut right to the chase, awkwardness and sort of awkward moments. Awkward's a bit of an interesting term. I would say more so quite natural and rather quiet and quite, again, normal moments and quite human moments are so important for anime as a whole because they're really good for humanizing the anime itself, and in many ways they're great for mirroring the human experience, something we've spoken about on this podcast numerous times when it comes to character acting. And creating a realistic human experience doesn't just belong in the place of animation, but also in terms of direction as well. The human experience is so important in many cases to emulate, since it really allows us to really understand and relate to these animated people and get to grips with the fact that these animated people are in fact real people in the context of their shows, despite living in these much more extreme and far-fetched scenarios. The far-fetched scenario in the case of something like Evangelion or Dynazenon would be these kaijus or these angels existing within this world. That is a far-fetched scenario, but we're still reminded that it's not to say that these things can take place within our world, but it's to remind us that these are humans just like us, reacting in the way that we probably would too. In the case of Gridman and specifically Dynazenon, because this is something I think that was pushed even further in Dynazenon more than it was in the Gridman series, I think this is great because it goes a really long way for showing that they live in a society where these kaiju attacks and mechas and such are somewhat normalized. Dynazenon, much more than Gridman, concerns this charade of being an antagonist or a protagonist and what this means, especially in the case of these repeated kaiju battles which we get almost every week, and even when this isn't occurring. And so Amamiya and co try to showcase what it's like to close the curtain behind the antagonist-protagonist thing, and what you realize is that these characters are very much human. We've seen it in the show where the antagonists, in quotation marks, would literally go to the cinema and go bowling and do things that we would do. And the protagonists also would act just like us and like awkward teenagers in their conversations and demeanors. And so Dynazenon really tries to blur this line between antagonist and protagonist, but also show that it is a performative role. It's something that we've taken for granted so much within various mecha anime that there will always be antagonists and protagonists, but I don't want to say Dynazenon doesn't also perpetuate that, but it shows that it is much weaker than we perceive it to be. They're not these binding roles that your entire life is consumed by you being an antagonistic person or character. But in fact, you're a human putting on a role for the sake of putting on a role. And that's why I really like Dynazenon, because it attempts to question this. How do we create a quote-unquote normal environment? How do we really buy in as viewers into this experience that this is a very normal world with kaijus in it? And so we have to look on the technical level, really. In the case of Dynazenon, I would say that this is a great combination of diegetic sounds, so we get a lot of sounds that they can hear in the world themselves. Great examples would be like you can hear the choir within the school, even if that kind of does serve as backing for the moment which is going on, but that's also part of the illusion and the genius of its filmmaking. And also very natural sounding voice acting as well. The dynamic between two of our main characters, Yomugi and Yume, is incredibly natural, and I give my hats off to both voice actors and the director as well behind the voice acting too. They really nailed that idea. They have these sort of muttered lines and Also pointing to very real and again awkward things like the sugar is getting everywhere in episode 5 in the Churro Scene when they want to sneeze. And the Churro Scene is going to be a lot of the basis for this analysis because it's probably the big part in Dynazenon where things I think the idea of awkwardness really became not just full circle, but I started to recognize it much more that it isn't just, there's the sneeze scene as well, but the churro scene as well, because it kind of went a bit viral online too. It's just a phenomenal moment to realize that it's such an integral part of what makes film human in a lot of cases, or TV shows or anime. I want to zoom in a bit on the sound. It's going to be difficult to talk about sound without any sound, but I'm sure you kind of get what I'm saying if you've watched the show, that is. And you probably should, again, if you are listening to this podcast. The diegetic sound, or what I like to call city noise, which is just the natural hum of the wind and generators or whatever else you probably hear in a city, is probably more awkward than silence. And just for clarity, I am saying this from the perspective of someone that does live and has lived in a city for a very long time, that city being London, and so I kind of understand where this is coming from. You can take this example and apply it to obviously towns and such, but I'd say that there's a different sort of city noise, especially if you go into the center of a town where it's really bustling. There is a sense of awkwardness created from the atmosphere, even if it isn't silence. The point isn't that it's silent, but it's a normal ambience. But I'm going to try and get into that. I would say sticking to realism, and in the case of a city, this is probably the equivalent of silence in the real world. Realistically, there aren't many areas where you would have genuine silence, where there are parts in the world, yes, but within in the case of a city, there aren't many places where you will have complete silence. Even if it is in the dead of the night, there will be the generator sounds, there'll be the construction sounds, there will be the boats with rich people going on it sounds. There's always something making noise. Something that I really love about Dynazenon, and I really appreciate, again, as a city dweller, I understand that, and they understand that, silence actually sounds more manufactured than actual ambience. And so they decide to bring in this quote-unquote backing track, which is the sound of life, the sound of what it really means to live in a place like this. We're once again reminded from the sound how normal life functions in a rather weird society with, again, kaiju and mecha battles within it. Everything else within Dynazenon feels normal besides that one element. And that's why I think it's a really effective mecha show, because the weight of having to pilot a kaiju, which you've never really thought about before, and just the idea of it all is so weighty to these characters. It means a lot, and yes, they do adjust to it, but it feels and it appears much more relatable to that of us and our own lives and having to learn a new thing. Another component in creating awkward scenarios in Dynazenon, but also in anime generally, is shot length. And I'm not so surprised that this was a thing in Dynazenon, as there does seem to be a lot of inspiration in places with this show, particularly its successor show. Evangelion is a show which is notorious and famous for creating awkward environments and situations, such as the elevator scene and the final scene in which Shinji is gripping Kaoru, and also the end of Evangelion. There's so many moments which I could dedicate to just these natural awkward moments in Evangelion, and Dynazenon does very similar things too. Obviously, I don't think this is a coincidence, as I do intend to make an episode on how Dynazenon is kind of mecha anime coming full circle in a lot of cases, and I think by adding these in, this is also a big part of the full circle effect. Not to say Evangelion created these, but I also think it's not a coincidence that they're there in Dynazenon. Having one long stationary shot just adds to the naturalness and awkwardness of the moment. There's not really much to explain as to why this is, but I also would say that similarly to if you were to look at someone in the face, I think because, okay, we're used to film being very cut up and very shot after shot after shot. It's about moving forward and progressing. And as soon as we stagnate that process, we eventually reach an awkward situation. But where does this derive from? I'm not a scientist, I'm not a psychologist, so I'm just speaking from, layman's normal person terms and just things I've only experienced myself. But I also think that as people, we're also very used to things moving fast, not just in film, but in general. When someone stares at you in the face for about 30 seconds, which is pretty much how long this shot is, it's about 20 something seconds. When someone looks at you for that long while doing nothing else, you can only question, why are they doing this to me? Why have they chosen me? And also it's just, you expect people, I think we have this expectation for people to just move on with their own things, even if you're in the same space. If you live with someone, you don't expect them to just stare at you for 20 seconds straight, but do their own thing. And when someone actually takes the time and attention to focus on one thing for so long, it's very uncomfortable. And I think that is converted into Dynazenon cinematography a lot of the time, and it makes us feel very uncomfortable. Just a bit of a mini but kind of related tangent. I've been talking a lot online about Hiroyuki Akira's filmmaking, and I call it very human in how it focuses a lot on human emotions and when humanity is at its darkest or at times even at its brightest. And that was mostly in the case of Jinro, but in the case of Dynazenon, I think we can kind of apply this concept of how, at least from the perspective of its direction, it's very human. I think that's the best way to put it. It films people and films life and captures it just like if somebody was to be filming it. It has a slight, ever so slight documentary feel to it in how it attempts to spectate and observe and capture for what it is. And I also think that, again, Amamiya and the team are really good at understanding what makes us uncomfortable. Probably because they're applying things that we can all relate to the making of this series. I think in terms of direction, just like animation, and we'll talk about studying and referencing in the case of character acting, with direction in stuff like Dynazenon, this does take a lot of looking inside of us and as people, what makes us uncomfortable, what makes us feel a bit cringe at times. And they exploit this very well. And I think this goes all the way back to people like Arno as well, but it's a really interesting dimension to, I don't want to quote series making, I'm just going to quote filmmaking, that I really enjoy, and it's really interesting to look into. It is upsetting to me when people call these long shots quite pretentious. I don't know where that comes from. I don't think it comes out of being cocky or being arrogant and just wanting to do it to do it. It creates a genuine feeling and effect. I think it's ironic when people point out that, yeah, it's pretentious and such, but it picked up your attention, and that's exactly what it did, and that's exactly the point of it. It's a move away from normal filmmaking, which is, as I said, in relation to space, it's chopped up, it's always convenient, and by creating an almost inconvenience for the viewer, forcing the viewer to actually observe and actually pay attention to this moment, rather than having the audience conveniently and passively moved through the runtime, I think is very effective. And by calling it pretentious, I think it's just you acknowledging that it did exactly what it was supposed to do, which was slightly change things up a bit and actively feel that extra bit uncomfortable. It kind of goes back to our analysis of space and aspect ratios, mostly space, all the way back. Space more in regards to the world and the spatial awareness we have when watching a film or consuming an anime. Space, I would say, in a lot of cases is under attack in how everything, again, is quite cut up conveniently. But we can't have amazing moments like this and like the Churro Scene or the sneeze scene in Dynazenon episode 1 and 5 if we're just to have anime conveniently on this chopping board. Letting anime breathe and metaphorically do its thing is so key for allowing it to deliver these ideas, and in fact it's fundamental in some cases for creating a sense of naturalness which we need for certain narratives to prosper, just like Dynazenon, just like Evangelion, for example. When Dynazenon or Gridman breaks away from the repetitive nature of its narrative, which is kaiju battle week by week, which isn't a bad thing, that's what I really like about it, but when it breaks away from this as the episodes get into the double digits, this natural feeling it creates in its filmmaking doesn't go to waste, as it only makes the unnatural deviating contrast much better. We can tell when something is unusual because what is normal has been established and is rooted within Dynazenon's identity. This series has always had a degree of subtleness to it. All these subtle references to previous mecha anime, some maybe not so subtle, but some subtle references to previous mecha anime. I believe there was a Pat Labor reference only a few episodes ago, for example, and how the ideas are layered within the music of the show. For example, the Human Love songs is quite literally conveying what this whole anime is about, but the way it's coded in, it doesn't try to be blatant. And it tries to, again, communicate its ideas in the most natural and subtle ways possible in some cases, which is quite ironic and I think that's also what is so beautiful about it. It goes against what we have previously thought of as a quite maybe bombastic and over-the-top approach to battling, which is, kaiju battles, and there's the massive monster here, we need to fight it, we need to defeat it, as we see in Tokusatsu or previous Power Rangers series, for example. And I really do enjoy how this takes a bit of a step back from that and does something different with what is thought to be a very over-the-top and quite grandiose theme and plot in general. Just another thing that came to my head, even when we think of the much more subtle imagery and themes communicated through the inanimate objects, Dynazenon takes advantage of railings so much. And you think, railings, how niche? Why would railings matter? Railings, in the case of Dynazenon, show restriction, they show pain, they show, and when they're taken away, a lack of restriction, autonomy. It's so many things. I know I'm speaking, I kind of sound like a philosopher right now, but these are so important. And it just shows that again, Amami and the team can take the nichest of things and turn it into a genuine vehicle for telling a phenomenal story. But this is why I say that we can't ignore these subtle things with it, which it does. And by dismissing it as pretentious, we can't really get to understand it and learn about it much better. Dynazenon is about subtlety and awkwardness and normality. That is what it is at its core, and by removing it, we remove a lot of what Dynazenon is as a visual and written piece. The Gridman series understands a very crucial component to creating what we can call true realism. I use that as a very wish-washy term. Please take that with a grain of salt. There isn't really true realism or not true realism, but I'd say the ultimate form of realism in film would be showing every single part. Would that be feasible? No. And this isn't done in Dynazenon. Dynazenon doesn't show you every single part of the characters' lives, but it shows you much more than perhaps quote-unquote normal film or TV would, because that's where we get this excellent narrative about the human mind and human nature in this show. And we can only really get that by going to and digging to the core of what humans are like on an everyday and normal basis when it's a school day on a Tuesday and they're out doing mecha activities. What do these people act like? And we're shown that it might not be completely comfortable, but the uncomfortable things are exactly what we as people do, and that's how we act. In order to comment on human nature and humanity and who we are and the human mind and human love, we have to just show humans for what they are. And these shows quite simply do exactly that. I think the discourse regarding world building often doesn't touch on things like this. It often is related to things which are quite distant from reality. But I think we need to also apply world building as a concept, if we're to use that term, to worlds that are very embedded in reality. Yes, you can make the case that we're already aware of how human society functions, but creating this much more natural and inconvenient atmosphere that resembles our world is very difficult, and it's something that not many filmmakers, I think, are able to do or are willing to do. In the case, again, it is relative to what you're trying to do, but in the case of SSSS.Dynazenon, there's such an effort to do this. And again, by calling this padding, we forget its purpose, which is to build up a natural world. To get to the core of world building, we have to start with stuff like the Churro Scene, or the sneeze scene in episode 1, or Grid Knight knocking his sword and making an awkward noise later into the series. We have to start with these in order to really get to grips with what world building can be, and not just limit it to building fictional worlds, but creating real and quite tangible ones. And on that note, that is the analysis for this week. I'm going to dive right into closing thoughts. I kind of concluded there, but I'm just going to try and wrap up everything which we've said during this episode. Creating awkwardness and normality is a fundamental part of Dynazenon, and to many anime as well, because it is a very necessary part of creating a realistic and feasible human experience which we can relate to. I would say that there are a few things that really work to make this whole, this concept of awkwardness. I would say diegetic sound. I would say quite normal, and normal is a weird term because it's kind of hard to say what is normal, what isn't, but at least much more natural sounding voice acting. And then I would say shot length is quite an important part of this too. This is such a massive part of what the Gridman series is. If it wants to explore human love and how people act and question antagonism, protagonism, and these performative roles which people take up, we have to start from basic human behavior. And it does that in its filmmaking. Often, space is, I always like to say, it's under attack. It's on this chopping board, as in everything is conveniently cut and edited to the points to which we want, and we get to the point very easily. Dynazenon kind of sidesteps this in some places, and yes, it is all intentional, but it doesn't feel as if that's its main priority, to be quick and to the point. It embraces all the small moments in between, the awkward silences and the moments that we're not really supposed to see amongst the antagonists, them having fun, them actually having lives. It builds a world, a realistic world, through these elements, and by dismissing it again as padding and filler, we ignore what it's really trying to do. Thank you for listening to this episode of Get In The Mecha. That has been episode 92. I hope you did enjoy this one. I really did enjoy this one. I am baking right now because it's kind of hot in the UK at the moment, and I'm in my room recording this after doing episode 91 as well, so I'm just doing back to back here. But I really did enjoy this one, and I hope you did too. I really am excited to see the Dynazenon finale. When I am recording this, it's 2 weeks away, and this should come out when the finale comes out, so that will be exciting, and I hope this aged well as well. Hopefully it does add some value to understanding, or just at least enjoying this series much more. If you do enjoy this podcast, as I say all the time, leave it a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts, and that can help out algorithmically as well. We've actually been climbing in the charts in quite a few places, so thank you so much for the support and continued support. And if you do want to support the show even more, a review would be very helpful. And also just leave some words as well. I'll read it out on the show as I've done before. And also, if you have any questions as well, I did want to say, if you have any questions, there are a few ways you can leave questions. You can, in the description, I have voice submissions, which I would be happy to continue to do. I'd love to answer a voice submission, maybe at the end of the podcast or at the beginning or somewhere. And also, you can leave a question within a review as well, with your review, and I'm definitely going to answer that. And then if you want to, you can always ask on Twitter as well. I might start doing questions there. I'll usually answer on Twitter, but you can do so for the podcast if you want that. And in the YouTube comment section too, as well. If you have a question for the podcast that I can answer, at a bit more length and in a bit more detail, then do so in the comment section below. Have a great weekend. Have a great rest of your day. Hopefully the Dynazenon finale went good. I have been your host Jamal today, and this has been Get In The Mecha. The music in this production goes as follows: Synthwave by Alex McCulloch, Difference by chasersgaming, Mandatory Overtime by Joth, and Anomaly by Matyas under soundimage.org.